Ladies and gentlemen, here we meet for a midnight lecture, and I will talk as announced about the end of the virtuoso. Since this takes place as part of an event that's called We Are the Robots, this topic may seem self-explaining or redundant at least. But when I look around, I realize some kind of persistent ubiquity of virtuosity. This paradoxical co-occurrence is somewhat fairly known in the cultural science. So we have the invention of photography during the 19th century, but to what end is it utilized? To prove the existence of ghosts. See this one here? The shadow in the left. Which is a fairly precise picture of our state of things. Surrounded by, immersed in an atmosphere of digital machinery, you are witnessing a cult of the real, authentic self, as if the common task is to prove that you're not a robot. Please click here. And that's why the question still makes sense, to me at least. Following just the word virtuoso. I will take you on a tour that will not only trace its change in meaning, but will give you a fast-forward survey from antiquity to our present times, to the virtual ecosystem we live in, and which seems to me a perfect ecosystem for post-human, robot-like species. My thinking about this subject, the point where I got into theory, goes back to a time when the digital world was still an unknown continent. That was in the mid-80s, and I stood in a sound studio, surrounded by the equipment of the day, a rhythm machine, a sequencer, a delay, a 16-channel MIDI program. All these were digital tools in their infancy, but they made me wonder. Trained in classical piano, as I was, I've been maltreated with tools like the School of Velocity or the Art of Finger Dexterity. With such a background, it's pretty weird that you simply raise velocity by means of a knob. Another weird experience, that the very precision of a rhythm machine turned out to be somewhat annoying. A reason for the software developers to add some artificial inaccuracy, which they called the humanizer function. But the biggest wonder was the discovery that there's no difference between a classical instrument and an arbitrary sound whatsoever. That everything, the sound of a toilet flush or a chattering dinnerware, could be a musical instrument, at times much more beautiful and ear-catching than a classical instrument. Since all these tools pointed to a single machine, the computer, my first question was, what kind of tool is this? And the second, how does it affect us human beings? Trying to analyze the virtuoso problem, we actually refer to the relation between man and machine. This relation goes way back, and that's what we will do. We will just listen what the word virtuoso stands for and what its etymological change of meaning reveals. So what's the etymology? Where does virtuoso come from? Any Latin pupils in here? All of you, which have taken the Latin classes at school, make crown now. However, we are facing gender trouble, since the virtuoso not only confronts us with virtus, which is courage or fortitude, but contains vir, which is man. Or better said, male. So virtus is the virtue of being a man. Given that this is a tautology, more or less, we find some elucidation if we're asking for the machinery this portrait of a man relates to. Maybe you get it if you see this picture. No, that's wrong. That's the contemporary one. The Roman one, slightly unchanged, looks like this. What you can see here is the so-called turtle formation, a brotherhood of soldiers that we may call, in a literal sense, Iron Man. And beware, that's the underground story to be told, the rise of the robots from antiquity to the present. When the Romans talked about manly behavior, what they had in mind was the fighting mode of the hoplite. This ironclad warrior that did not appear as an individual but as part of a formation, in uniform, so to speak. But how does this fight actually take place? Let's have a look at a single warrior. In his right hand, he holds the spear. In his left hand, the shield. Now imagine that this soldier confronts an enemy as shielded as he is. His enemy's spears directly points to his manhood, his sex. So we might assume that he might use his shield to protect himself. No, that's wrong. The shield in the left is not meant for self-protection, it's meant to protect his neighbor's sex. And that means the grace of charity, or Nächstenliebe, is nothing that you will just indulge in Sunday sermons. It is a bloody duty. Okay? Neighbor sex, and this one protecting me. And it's a bad choice to stand just at the right, just at the left. So you're all alone. As an answer, I may introduce an institution that has created some amazement even in antiquity, the Sacred Band of Thebes, an army consisting of 150 pairs of male lovers. Once again, gender trouble. Do we have to think of these men as homosexuals? Or given that a pair consisted of an elder and a very young man, a band of homosexual pedophiles? So, asking for the virtus, we're passing from one riddle to another. But remember, we know that the soldier's virtue has something to do with the machine. So, what does the machine, the Greek mechane, stand for? Side note, we're in Greece now, since the hoplite is an invention of the Greeks. And surprise again, the Greeks talked about a machine long before there was an evidence for a mechanical device. The thing which mostly resembled a machine was the notorious Deus ex machina, this theater crane that allows a god to fly in and solve, by some ingenious machination, the tragical conflict. In the case of Aeschylus, it is the goddess Athena who flies in and saves the hero. But the interesting point is not this magical solution, but the self-characterization of this goddess. She says, "For me, no mother bore within her womb. I vouch myself the champion of the man." Or to put it bluntly, I am unborn, therefore I'm backing the man. And that's the point. That beautiful sound. Shall I repeat that one? Bad choice. So no virtuoso talent here. Okay. She is not born by a woman, but by her father, or to be more precise, she was an implant that had to be surgically extracted out of her father's head. You know the story of Hephaestus, just getting Athene out of his head. And then she sprang out, as the myth tells us, fully armed. Just like one of our Iron Man soldiers. And that's exactly the Greek meaning of mechane, and that's betrayal of nature. Okay, you get it? Betrayal of nature, being unborn. So it's no machinery device, just betrayal of nature. An artificial intelligence that creates a likewise artificial being. When we ask for the artificial intelligence, assuming that this will allow us to arrest the initial machine, we will have to deal with another myth, the birth of Zeus. Don't be afraid. When we solve this last riddle, everything's laid out to understand. So let's talk about how Father Zeus, the first surviving male god, so as some philologists have found out, which is really interesting. All these gods before just died in an annual frequency, like, okay, there's a seed and there's a harvesting, etc. They have to die in the wintertime. Okay, he's surviving. And let's ask how he came into being. The goddess Rhea, one of these all-potent mother goddesses, is expecting the birth of her son. But to protect the kid from his jealous father Kronos, who would eat up the child instantaneously, she needs protection. And she finds it with the so-called dactyls, some earthborn, dwarf-like iron creatures. Since they are equipped with shields, they make a lot of noise, beating on them. Therefore, Kronos overhears the cries of the newborn. These dactyls, please keep that in mind, are understood as the inventors of music. We don't know why. But what we know, though, is that we have a very, very powerful rhythm section on our mythical stage. Zeus survives and is raised up in a secret cave. So you can see it here, it's Mount Ida in Crete, still existing and excavated last century. And the myth tells us about some holy bees that nourish the child with nectar and ambrosia, and that once a year there's a big fire to be seen from the cave. The hidden and secret place incites the curiosity of some soldiers. To protect themselves against some possible bee attack, they get rigged, cover their faces with plaster, and march forward. Once they get inside of the cave's entrance, the killer bees detect them and start their attack. But there's a little moment when they see what's going on in the cave, just a blink of the eye before they morph into birds and fly away. And what do they see? I have to be aware. What's the secret they shall not see and shall see anyway? A god in diapers. That's not Zeus, obviously, but I could not find any picture depicting this myth. What a stupid story, you might think, and how to make sense of it. The answer is quite simple, but it demands our willingness to analyze the element of the myth, not as a fairy tale bizarreness, but as an image that tells us something about its origin, about the real machinery. Okay. Let's jump to the most advanced technology of the Bronze Age, the so-called lost wax casting. Here we have a model made out of wax, which explains the bees, by the way. This wax model is surrounded by a layer of plaster. Remember our brave soldiers covering their faces with plaster. And then this formation is equipped with some tubes. What happens when the formation gets heated? The plaster gets solid, and the molten wax flows through the tubes out of it, leaving a void, the negative, so to speak. And now this void, dug to the earth, is filled with molten bronze, and then it cools out. And in the end, that's the moment our brave warriors catch a glimpse of the plaster jacket is cast off, and we too see the god in diapers. Here we have the machine we are looking for. It's a betrayal of nature insofar as this metallurgical birth replaces the conventional one. All the letter gods of Greek culture, Dionysos, Athena, are full metal gods. Like the first automaton on Crete, the giant Talos, who keeps the island safe from strangers. So that's this one. You know it from some movies. Everybody loves it because it's the first automaton, and nobody knows. They didn't have a machine, but thought of automatons. That's kind of weird. But you know why now? Remember, I told you that the Iron Man dwarfs, our rhythm section, the dactyls, which you can assume also as the 7 dwarfs because they have names like Hammer, Amboss, etc., count as the inventors of music. Here we can follow a direct link that leads us to much more advanced mathematical thinking. This story tells us that how Pythagoras, yes, the mathematician, discovered the laws of music and musical intervals after having spent some time in this mystic cave, exactly there where Zeus was raised, this mystic cave of Zeus. One day, he was passing a smithy and heard that the hammers inside were harmoniously ringing. Analyzing them, he found that their weights related to each other in whole number intervals, 2 to 1 for an octave, 3 to 2 for a fifth, and so forth. In this case, no god is cast, but the metaphysics of numbers, which is understood as the driver of music too. Being a musician or just a contemporary, there's a high chance that you will encounter someone sometime telling you enthusiastically about the Pythagorean music of the spheres. So here we see once again this discovery of the intervals, and that's the music of the. This is a really tricky thing. It's all numbers. You see, the top is the 1, then the 2 and 3. The 1 is like the all-generating principle. It's a whole religion about this one. So, to make it short, we have asked for the meaning of virtus and got into the cave of the killer bees where the Iron Man has been formed, a new mechanical god. And when we think of the Roman soldiers acting in uniform, such an idea of manhood is promoted, a man that has cast off his weaker self, or as a German would put it, seinen inneren Schweinehund. Much more drastically. Now we can see the first major transformation of the concept deeply interwoven with Christianity, but also with the transformation of the machine. The soldierly virtues, which are justice, temperance, fortitude, and prudence, are transformed into Christian virtues, which get accompanied by another 3 cardinal virtues: faith, love, and hope. And that's why Christianity does not speak of a single virtue anymore, but of virtutes, 7 of them. If the human side of the man-machine symbiosis undergoes a modification, it might be due to a modification to the machine. What happened then? I have another try with this one. After we have seen how the in vitro fertilization of the Iron Man took place, Christianity confronts us with a spectacle which is really, really unique. Basically, the leitmotif is the very same as with the metallurgical technique. Birthing is not left to nature anymore, but to human craftsmanship. However, the difference is that we do not operate in the physical space, but in the realm of pure symbols. When you look at the Gospels, you know that the word, the sound, is fruitful as such. What philologists would call, theologists, logos spermatikos. But how can you overcome the dilemma that Christ is born by the earthling Maria? How can a God be not contaminated by living in the womb of a woman, which traditionally is depicted as damp, dark, and dreary dungeon? The answer which the theologians come up with is as simple as ingenious. If God is the Word, Mary has conceived it through her ear and has given birth to it the very same way, in here, out there. It's beautiful, really beautiful. An ear conception, which is the fundamental for the Immaculate Conception that I prefer to call a Himmelfahrtskommando. As a kind of proof, here's a painting from the 15th century. Here you can see the little Jesus riding on a ray of light directly into the ear of the Virgin. Okay? But besides that, the painting is a marvelous sign, but this dogma turned out to be a midwife for the medieval university as well as the printing press. It's all about intellectual birthing, betrayal of nature, so to speak. Although this Christian machinery has been extremely successful and impregnated the Gothic Europe with an enthusiasm for novelties of that kind, another change of the virtutis concept took place. The reason for that, you will guess it meanwhile, is due to a change of the machine. Sometimes in the 12th century, the wheelwork struck the minds of the scholastics. Like the computer, the wheelwork is a universal machine. You can use it to any given end. You can create a clockwork. But also an automaton that triggers a group of figures, mostly at the outside of cathedrals. You see these little figures moving like automaton. You can use it as a middle, but also as a musical mechanism that allows you to program a series of sounds. It's no accident that instrumental music emerges, polyphony, a modern time-based notation. In these times, yeah? For the first time, the intellectuals encounter machines which are physical and no mere brainy constructs. Using the printing press, a single man can reach millions of people, and we can see how Luther as an individual wraps up a large institution. This privatization of the means of production is comparable to what we see happening today, Google, Facebook, etc. And it's exactly what we are used to call Renaissance, a process of creative destruction. From this period dates the first book that deals with the dignity of man, Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man. What is the dignity of man for a Renaissance philosopher? Pico writes, if he, man, cultivates his vegetable seeds, he will become a plant. If he cultivates his rational seeds, he will become a heavenly animal. Who will not wonder at this chameleon? So, the dignity of man is being a chameleon, which is beautiful. And this very chameleon character the Renaissance calls virtu. When we compare the virtu with the medieval virtutis, you may ask yourself, what's the novelty? It's this, that the individual, if he wants so, is capable of giving himself the air of a brave, prudent, and loving man. That is what we may call virtuosity. The ability to perform on stage or in public to make others believe in the appearance you give. This implies that you can play freely on the instrument that you are. Just read Machiavelli's Principe, and you get an idea of this way of thinking. Virtuosity is nothing but applied Machiavellism. As you know, virtuosity may be manifold, but all these forms imply some form of professionalization. The 16th century, for example, was enchanted by pure and crisp, puerile voices that we may call the hoplites of the sentimental, appropriately so, since the production of these angelic voices was a bloody, bloody business. To preserve their purity, they got singing lessons in specialized schools, and with the time it came, the sexuality got hamstrung. So a new castrato was born that entertained the audience, and in the times of Farinelli, that 18th century, got the attraction of the masses. Very strange sex symbol indeed. It might be outdated, but the idea of the virtuoso is still alive, although revealing, as the Guinness Book of Records tells us, more and more bizarre traits. In my personal world chronicle, the last virtuoso became extant with the last castrato, which is Alessandro Moreschi. And he lived in the Vatican, and he did some recordings, by the way. So, and if you want to go to YouTube, just listen to the Ave Maria of Alessandro Moreschi. That's a really, really bizarre piece of music. So, taking a more popular point of view, I would link the death of the virtuoso to the French Joseph Pujol. Anybody is knowing Joseph Pujol? You know him. You love him. Okay, who became very popular as a so-called fartist. Okay, a fartist. And who worked out a vast repertoire of virtuoso farting. So you see him here. You see this little candle and this blow. But he was a public relations genius because he had even more convincing, like this one. So he had a really great repertoire of farting. He farted Au clair de la lune or the good King Dagobert, as well as, and that's a really cool thing, a great fart improvisation that aimed to recreate the great earthquake in San Francisco, 1906. So I would love to hear that, but that's music. It just fades away and... Okay. As you see, I date the death of the virtuoso way back. He might be still around, but if so, he just does not know he's dead. The reason for that is that in my personal word chronicle, the birth of the internet goes way back. It's not in the 1990s, that's really rubbish. In my understanding, the internet has been founded in the year 1746, to be precise. What, you may ask? Yes, I would say. For me, the internet starts up in 1746. So, what's the corresponding story? The corresponding story goes like this. Imagine a field in northern France, okay? And there are 600 monks gathering. And what do these monks do? They form a large circle, a few 100 meters in diameter, and then they begin to connect themselves with copper wire, okay? And when this is done, one of these men, Monsieur Abinoli, touches a jar from which some kind of antenna protrudes. And what happens? Anybody has an idea what happens now? All the monks start shaking convulsively. Also, although this act seems very odd, we do not encounter some occult practice, but a real, strict scientific experiment. In this year of 1746, the cultivated people had learned how to store electricity in a jar. Furthermore, they had learned that copper wire would transmit the strange electric fluid. Therefore, the question was, how fast does this fluid move? Is there a time delay comparable to the waves that we can see in our stadium or sport arenas, where the so-called La Ola, where we have a time shift, okay? Is there any time shift in the movement of the fluid? The answer was somewhat surprising. There was no delay. All the monks started shaking instantaneously. If we compare this with our hoplite formation, the difference is evident. Okay, you see, wonderful. What these people thought, like, you ever heard about Galvani, who was galvanizing his frogs? So they just had the idea. So it's like an element of life, and you can reanimate some beings. So they had the idea that you could open up graves and just galvanize somebody. The idea of Frankenstein is all about this. Yeah, it's like Frankenstein, as Mary Shelley tells it, like the blitz is the bolting and the thunder and bolting is going down. Electricity is stored, and a corpse, which is made of dead body parts, is being reanimated. So it's a whole literature which is very interesting in the early 19th century. The Romans needed the virtue to coordinate the movements of the soldiers. Today, the electricity comes out of the socket, and you may reach millions of isolated individuals thereby. On the other hand, the picture of the white monk makes clear that the notion of the individual, virtuoso even, does not make sense anymore. Here we see Mesmer, the same guy like in the 18th century, like mesmerizing people and leading them to orgasms. So he did not use electricity but magnetism. So very interesting also. And just read Mesmer, it's beautiful. Even I am in a highly privileged position now, like I'm now talking in monologue. The moment I get in contact with the antenna, and that's interesting, the moment I get in contact with the antenna, I get incorporated. Touched by the general movement, I'm just shaking in sync. In any way, the position of the authorship changes. And maybe you understand why a contemporary artist would not characterize himself as a virtuoso anymore, but would plug himself into some high energy that's mostly political context. You may object, okay, you have demonstrated a case of modern networking, the birth of the man in the crowd, etc. But what does this have to do with a digital computer? But then I would ask back, what's the characteristic of a processor? A processor is characterized by the feature of synchronicity, that there is no time difference between point A and point B. Accordingly, we could call the network of our synchronized monks a human processor, a machine not made out of steel and glass, but out of human nerves and emotions. So in this way, this answers the question I've asked myself when I stood in the sound studio, totally perplexed by a new, upcoming digital world. Actually, my original notion was fairly correct. Somehow our morale is linked to the machine, and in this context, electricity means a paradigm shift allowing telematic and worldwide actions. If we call this continent virtuality, two aspects stand out. First, there is a new language that does not care if somebody utilizes alphanumerical letters, the sound of his voice, or his body movements. Whatever gets electrified can get digitized and therefore writing. Because of that, movements can morph into sound, sound into images, and these can transform themselves into an abstract parameter space which you may store or reproduce simultaneously here or at any given place in the world. We call it multimedia, hypermedia. I would speak of electromagnetic writing, since we may use anything. I would speak of it, so why not use the whereabouts of a whale or the flap of a butterfly to make a vehicle on Mars move accordingly? Talking about the end of the virtuoso means that the mastership over our personal body is not crucial anymore. Our virtue has separated itself from our body. It has floated into the realm of the virtual, thither where we operate with bodiless tokens. However, and here the question of morality reappears again, we send these messages not into the void. Instead, we're trying to find something about ourselves. One of the strangest, most surprising learning processes is the discovery that we are different, not the ones that we thought we'd be. I make a recording of my voice and hear something unheard of. I make a video of myself and detect a little tick, an unconscious automatism that I never ever dreamt of. I see a photography of my face, but it's totally alien to me. And I feel that it does not make sense anymore to think of myself as a compact, monolithic self. Maybe I'm not an individual, but a dividual, divisible. We can make a rule out of that. Anybody, you and me, is but a series of beings, avatars, partial existences, and so forth. Insofar, the strange phenomenon of the 19th century ghost photography is, in a metaphorical way, quite illustrative. That photography has been invented to prove the existence of ghosts. And since it's midnight now, I wish you a lot of fun with this flock. Be nice and friendly. You might need them sometime. So, thank you very much. I hope you're too tired to ask questions. But if so, I would be the victim. Yeah, that's a nice place here. Like, it really reminds me of the early '90s, and I was in kind of audio art in the early '90s. Did some experimental sound stuff. Therefore, the connection to the sound world. And it's a nice place here. It was nice music we heard. Okay. Yeah, have a nice evening.